Ladies and gentlemen, what an honor for Claire and me to have the very first focus topic presentation of the Airline Crewing Enigma, the expert think tank in LinkedIn, a global community of 106 airlines. We are 240 members to date, and we want to improve the visibility and the know-how in our airline community. And Claire, Ted, and I, we were discussing in August what could we do together, and the outcome was the Airline Crewing Enigma. And today we have our first session. So my name is Daniel Stecher. I work for IBS Software and do the global business development. And it's my big pleasure that today we have a real expert who is covering our first focus topic presentation about crew rostering, Paul Donaghy from Singapore. So I think the presentation is around about 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And I think you saved some time for question and answers during the session. On the other hand, you are all invited to post your questions during the session already in the chat notes. And then we can already start after the presentation to answer these questions. And in the question and answer session later on, you can use the raise your hand feature of MS Teams that we kind of can structure the discussion. So I wish us fantastic 45 to 60 minutes. Paul, stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for taking the time today to watch my focus topic presentation. As you all know, one of our main objectives is to share best practices with each other on various topics. And the topic that I have picked is rostering. So before I start, I'd just like to turn off the camera and I'll start the presentation, and I'll put the camera back on once the presentation is complete. I want to also emphasize that the content of this presentation is based purely on my own experiences and observations. It is in no way meant to discredit any system or airline. I also think aircrew planning is one of the most challenging and least understood areas in an airline, and rostering is definitely one of the least understood. So, who am I? The 1970s was a time when everything was manual. A time of telex machines and miles of tape filled with data. Towards the end of the 70s, IT departments began expanding. Enormous green screen monitors appeared on desks and counters. They occupied about 75% of our available space. But it was a time when some of the manual processes were being replaced. There were good times and bad times, especially when we had a system outage. What happened then was we had to go back to a manual process. This was both time-consuming and cumbersome. We continued this process until the green screens flickered back to life. Sometimes they would sleep for many hours, but when they did wake up, we had to hand key everything that we had done manually into the system. And then, of course, when everybody was using it, it slowed down to a crawl. It was very frustrating. I started with an airline who had just finished negotiating its crew work rules with its local unions. The changes agreed upon would gain crew productivity and rostering would become automated. The offset for this was preferential bidding, and that was a nightmare on its own. Crew had to learn to bid for trips they wanted. The seniors picked the best, and the rest of the flying was left for the juniors. No one really knew much. Some crew received incorrect information, so then the unions became involved. They were quite a militant group, and changes they had agreed to and sold to their members had slapped them in the face. They became less agreeable to ad hoc changes. They wanted more involvement in the rostering process. They actually wanted to drive it, as if that was going to happen. On top of this, we had inadequate hardware to run the rosters. There was also a lack of support. Many of the processes we managed in support of rostering were still manual. The preferential bidding system had definitely been oversold. It created a distinct us and them environment. We had to use desktop applications to function. We had paper everywhere. I would beg for help. But because no one really knew what rostering was about, except for the fact that it gave them a headache, things never changed. But it was during this time I learned so much about system functionality, and I knew there were big gaps between certain processes. Eventually, senior management decided to change the crew management system. A vendor was selected, months of development and testing occurred. Lots of money was spent too. Did it get better? No. Did any of the previous manual functions become automated? Again, no. The response was always the same. Paul, it's outside of the scope of the project and there's no budget for it. Why, you might ask? Because we had been excluded from the discussions at the very beginning. Decisions had been made by those who did not know, so nothing changed. I think I aged 20 years doing that job, but it taught me a lot, and in hindsight, I'm grateful for it. I began consulting in the 2000s. I worked with local airlines. They all faced similar rostering problems. Some of the processes were manual, others were automated. Schedules were often late, and a lot of the crew days were spent working on the ground. I worked with crew unions, and because I had a good working knowledge of FTLs and company rules, I was mainly answering questions. I began to understand why the crew were confused. The unions didn't know what they wanted. How would the crew know? It was quite weird, I thought. I've been fortunate to view aircrew planning and the rostering process as a planner, a manager, a business analyst, consultant, crew member, and a vendor. So, what is rostering? This is a simple example. The output is a crew roster. On average, airlines complete the rostering process 1 month at a time. But what are the objectives of this process? The publication of crew rosters by a specified date is most important. Each roster is legal, another important factor. We also need to make sure the work's spread evenly. There's one more important thing. It has to be cost efficient. So to the layman, that's not hard. What's the problem? Aircrew rostering is an important part of airline operations. Crew costs are in the top 5 big ticket items. So yes, why is it so hard? Since the 1990s, we have seen numerous changes in how airlines compete in the market. One example is no frills. My thought on that is, don't pay for what you don't really want or need. But unfortunately, this can go a bit further. Employ the absolute minimum number of people. Pay for a crew management system that will get by with the regulator. Because once it's implemented, it's hard to remove or upgrade. Aircraft are becoming more efficient. Longer range means a bigger network with non-stop flights or ultra long-haul routes. In the past, airlines have needed to adapt to global activities, such as war, volcanic activity, pandemics, just to name a few. But in most cases, I think airlines have done well here, and technology has certainly assisted. But I wonder, how much progress has technology really made in aircrew planning? Based on customer demand, schedules can change frequently because every airline creates a schedule for profit. But how quickly can we, as planners, adapt to these changes without losing efficiencies? A small time change could increase the annual crew costs by hundreds of thousands of dollars. But how do we see that? How can we react to it? So I believe there are two main drivers in aircrew planning. The what, being what needs to be performed by the aircrew. For an example, converting the schedule into flight duty periods, plan recurrent training, allocate vacation, administrative days, management flying, administer crew-based changes or category changes, just to name a few. The next step is the how to allocate. These are fairly common, or we can use a combination of them all. We know the what and the how, but do we ask ourselves why? Why do we create rosters the way we do? Is there a better way, a more efficient way? I believe aircrew planning occurs in various layers of process, and rostering is at the bottom. Every other layer sits on top, crushing this process. Quite often, the fallout flows into OCC, crew scheduling. So some of the drawbacks that I have experienced in these methods, preferential bidding, I think it encourages motive bidding. Others may choose day trips. Some people look for high-paying allowances. Others look for climate because they've got special activities they wish to undertake. And in reality, who wants to go on a very long pairing to a location that's cold and miserable with very low allowances? Early morning day trips, those I like. So all of the trips no one wants fall to the junior crew. A senior can bid, create the ideal roster, and then sell it. Juniors may have a roster where the value of their line is lower than the limit, which is a different problem. Plus, it could create open time or unfilled duties. All of those duties which no one wants and are hard to fill. We've got bid lines. Similarly, these things happen. This is often because of the displacement of duties because of the pre-allocations that the crew have for the line that they bid. Again, low lines and open time occurs. But a bid line can also mean a crew line type, where crew are specifically reserve or specifically flying. Whichever option is available, they all have their own flaws. Pure assignment is where the planners will assign flying and standby duties, and they make an attempt to create a fair shared dissemination, but that's not always possible. And this can obviously cause a low morale in crew and generate a high rate of attrition. But there is one significant barrier with the methods that allow crew to bid. The schedule has to be made available and published in order to give crew time to review and plan their bids. This, in my experience, does not go down well with network planners. Any changes to the schedule after its release would be passed over to crew scheduling in OCC. This can cause an increase in crew costs and a loss of any efficiencies gained from the rostering process. When this happens, blame rostering. As the layman said, what's the problem? Do we as planners need to get smarter in how we do things? Have we actually progressed? or are we still doing the same old thing? Schedules drive recruitment. We all know this. We all know that the utilization is entirely dependent on the schedule and how much flying can be achieved from each crew member every day. Annual crew utilization is primarily driven by the daily utilization, and this determines crew recruitment. But how many crew sets do we really need? Consider the daily demand. Are there more things to be done on a given day than there are crew? For example, we've got 6 captains and there's 7 things to be done. How can we manage it? How do we prevent it? How many airlines do not reach crew block hour targets? How many plan to the upper block hour value? Hearsay suggests crew are overworked, fatigued, or there is not enough crew. What causes this? The schedule or employment? How should we ensure crew must-do activities are allocated? How do we manage to change a base or a rank mid-roster period? What impact do these processes have on the roster outcome? An example from training scheduling. When crew are required on ground in a classroom environment, quite often with a crew facilitator, for example, a one-day classroom training session, this activity could create a shortfall of crew on a specific day. We need to pre-allocate training events to ensure the crew do them. But our blind actions may result with insufficient crew to cover a flight period or a standby period. Manpower planning can recruit more crews to cover for vacation days, training days, and other non-flying activities. However, these crew provide additional roster days, not a surplus for on-the-day coverage. When I first started creating rosters using preferential bidding, they were published monthly. And every month it was the same old diatribe. Why is there so much uncrewed flying? Why don't we have enough crew? There are many crew lines below the average. Why don't we have enough standby coverage? And the most famous expression of all, why didn't I get anything I bid for? These are great questions, and they should be asked. Unfortunately, some of the questions fell on deaf ears. So yes, working in rostering did feel like I was working in isolation. So what could technology offer us today? What do we want a vendor to provide? I believe our manual processes create roster inefficiencies and are time-consuming. But if these processes were automated, could our results be improved? If so, by how much and how would it be measured? How many crew sets could we save? How do we manage pre-allocations? How do we manage base changes and a change in rank mid-roster period? Can we meet our objectives? Allocate all the flying and standby? Spread the work evenly? Provide a work-life balance and be cost-effective? I suspect not. And the main reason for this, we wouldn't be here talking about it. So, every airline I've worked with has a mixture of both automated and manual processes. Some of the processes which form part of the roster build need to be pre-allocated, guaranteeing the activities are allocated in a roster. But what do I want a system to do for me? Some requirements come to mind. I want to see what the projected flying program looks like. I want to see if the flying fits into the crew lines. I want to see the daily tasks already pre-allocated. I want the manual processes automated. There should be an avoidance of fatigue when assigning trips. I want to use special attributes of crew when a flight duty requires them. I want to run a simulation every time from a different schedule when it's proposed. I want reports. I want to create my own reports. And I want to run it all quickly. Maybe some airlines already have this. They can produce rosters with all the flying covered, have enough standby, and all the must-dos are included. I want to know which rules have an adverse effect on my roster objectives. I want our current company rules evaluated and tested. Any future rules need to be tested before implementation. One thing I do know, all airlines are doing the same thing. The difference is the size, and this brings in additional complications. Based on my own experiences, could a vendor provide everything I need? Do we have the time and the budget? Right now, I think not. But do you, the audience, want to share your wish list with us? Please let us know. I'd be keen to see what you think. This concludes my presentation, and I'll just switch on the camera and stop presenting. And do you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make?
First of all, Paul, thank you for the presentation. I think